One of the biggest interview questions that you will face as a DBA would be how SQL query execution happens inside a database. But to understand the SQL query execution inside a database, first you must understand how a user connects to a database. What are the different things that happen inside a database, how a connection is handled, and from where to where the connection is given. In this lesson, we'll understand both the database connectivity of a user and also the SQL execution. Let us start. The first thing that we have is user connectivity. If you look at any system or any real-time system, your server will reside at a remote place and everybody will connect to a server. Or mostly what happens is all the databases are like a three-tier architecture system. The first tier would be your users, the second tier would be your application, and third tier would be your database. Database will reside on one server, your application will reside on another server, and your users will connect to the application from their local machines. This is the general connectivity that happens in real time. Let us look at this connectivity once again. We have a database. This is the database server and our database name is prod.db. We have an application. Let us assume our application is SAP and this resides on one server, and we have multiple users, remote users who connect to the SAP application server via their local systems. They connect to SAP server and then whatever query they process or whatever action they perform onto the SAP screens, those actions are performed between the SAP server and your database server. Sometimes users might save a data that becomes an insert from your SAP server to one table in database. Sometimes users will update their data. When they update, nothing but same SQL query from SAP server is passed on to the database server where it will update one record inside the database. Sometimes users might delete their account. The same delete command is passed from the SAP server and one entry from the table is removed. This is how your three-tier systems work. The first tier would be your users. The second tier would be your application server. And your third tier would be your database. We are database administrators. Our job is to administer the database servers. We are not bothered about how SAP server is configured. We are not bothered about how users connect to SAP server and all. We are bothered only about our database server. But the next question is how clients generally connect to the database. Let us assume, okay, we are not having a three-tier architecture. We are not having any application server. I have a user and I have a database. I want to connect from this user to the database. So how would these users connect to the database? Let us look at two-tier system. This is our database server where prod.db is our database which is running, and we have multiple users. These are the user systems. Right. These users can never directly connect to the database server. They need some interface, right? Something should be there which talks to the database, right? For example, let's take you have a printer at home and you want to print something. Then this printer driver must be installed in your local system in order to get the printout, correct? Or if you want to open a Word document on your system, then you need to have MS Office installed, on your local system so that you can open the Word document. The same way, when you want to connect to a database, there must be some application or something that must be installed on local system which talks to your database server. If you don't install the minimum driver or minimum software, you won't be able to talk to the database server. Simple as that. One more example is when we have a Linux server, we use Putty, a third-party tool which is installed on our local system in order to connect to the Linux server. That means to perform any operations on your database server, you need a mediator between your local system and your database server. And that mediator is known as database client. Let us look at one more way of understanding about database client. Database client is a software that you download and install onto the user machine. Let's take we have one user. This user is using Windows. You have to download the database client software for Windows because it should be compatible with the host where it is running, not with the database server. Your user operating system is Windows, so you need to install the database client for Windows. And this database client is the one which enables you to talk to a database server. And this database client is provided once again by Oracle. So once you have the database client, you can use the client to connect directly to the database. There is a difference between Putty and database client. When you use Putty, you connect to the Linux server. But when you use DB client, you connect to the database only. That means you cannot perform the OS level things onto the Linux server where this database has been installed. Database client is only an interface which allows you to remotely connect to your database, but you can't do anything onto your Linux server. But if you want to work on your Linux server, you can always have Putty. And the best part of Putty is like you can also connect to the database, because when you log into directly Linux server remotely and your database is running on this Linux server, definitely from Putty you can connect to your database also. We'll not talk about this concept right now. Right now our goal is to understand what happens when a client tries to connect to a database server. We'll take one client. Client is using Windows, and on Windows, client has installed database client software. Now, when you install the database client software that is also provided by Oracle, this software should be accessed by CMD, your command prompt, and under command prompt you will once again start SQL plus utility. When you start this SQL plus utility, what happens is in the background on your Windows system, a background process is created. Now what is the background process? It's nothing but an operating system level process which handles all the requests. Let us look at the current background processes running on my system. What I'll do is I'll go to the task manager, and if we look at all the apps that are currently running, we can simply see that Google Chrome process is running. We have GoToMeeting, we have Microsoft PowerPoint, we have Paint, and we have Task Manager because we have opened the Task Manager also, and Windows Explorer will by default will always be there. The same way when you start the database client on your system, or when you start CMD and then SQL plus, what happens is it creates a background process on your system. Every application that you use, it will create a background process, and that background process is the one which will handle entire process, right? So the background process which runs on a user machine is known as user process. Once again, the background process which runs on user machine is known as user process. Perfect. Now let's get back to user connectivity. User process on user system makes connection to the server running Oracle database. Now we know that when you run SQL Plus utility on a Windows system, it will create a background process, and because it is on a user system, it becomes a user process. Now this user process will connect to a remote database server. Next, the user process provides user ID password to the server for authentication. What happens is when you try to connect from your Windows machine to a database server, definitely you will have to pass your credentials. When you pass your credentials, you will be giving all the details like the user ID, password. Sometimes you also give the IP address and the port number also. User process on the user system is responsible to take this user ID, password, IP, port details from user system and pass it on to your server. On the server side, the listener service accepts all incoming connections and hands over to PMON. Now what is this listener? On a database server, we have a database, and from our previous session we have learned that our database instance, which runs on RAM, and we have database which is stored on hard disk drive. This is our DB server. On the same DB server, there will be a service which runs, and it is known as listener. Don't worry, I'm just drawing it outside the server, but this service also runs onto the RAM, or nothing but a background service onto the database server. When your client tries to connect from your machine, when the client tries to connect to the database server, definitely there will be a user process. The job of user process is nothing but to collect the user ID, the password, and sometimes IP port details from the user machine and pass it on to the listener. So this user process is responsible to collect all the authentication data from the user system and send it to the listener. On the server side, listener is like a gatekeeper. What is the job of listener? First, it will check whether the details provided are not. What it means that whether user ID is given or not, whether password is given or not, whether IP details are given or not, whether port details are given or not, right? Next, what listener will do is, when you look at a listener, simple, it looks like a human ear because it will always be ready to listen for the new connections. So listener job is to just listen for new connections and then pass it on to the database. On the database side, there is a process which handles all the new connections, and that process name is called as PMON. So once again, user process on user system makes connection to server running Oracle database. User process provides user ID password to server for authentication. Listener service accepts all incoming connections and hands it over to the PMON. Next, PMON performs authentication using base tables. For now, just understand base tables are the tables which will store the details of the users. In our further lessons, you will understand exactly what are base tables. For now, we'll assume that there is a base table which has the details of all the user ID and passwords. What PMON will do is it will perform the authentication using the base tables. PMON will take the user ID password from the listener. It will cross-check the user ID and password in the base tables. Next, once authenticated, user will receive an acknowledgement statement. This can be either successful or unsuccessful message. If the user ID password provided are correct, the connection will be successful. If it is not, then definitely there will be an error message. Next, if successful connection, PMON will create server process and a memory will be allocated to that server process, which is called as PGA, Private Global Area. And finally, server process is the one which will do work on behalf of user process at the server end. Let us look at all these steps in the Oracle architecture diagram and then understand once again. Now this is the Oracle architecture. For now, don't worry about so many components over there. Just follow what I'm saying, because we'll be learning about each and every component one by one. The first thing, we already know what is the user process. User process is the one which runs on a user machine. The user process will send the details to something called as listener. There is a layer called as listener over here. Now the listener, what it will do is from the user process, it will get the user ID, password and other details, and then listener will hand it over to a background process that runs on a database server, and the name of the background process is PMON. What PMON will do is PMON will search, or PMON will validate the details against the base tables. You have something called as base tables. For now, we know that base table is the one which stores the user ID, password data. Okay. This base tables, by default, they all reside under the system table space. So where do we have system table space? This is the system table space that we have. Remember, all your base tables will reside under system table space. We will assume that we just now started our database server, which means this part, this is my database instance, right? And we know that our database instance reside on RAM, which further drills down. If we start our system, that means there will be nothing in RAM, right? So what PMON will do is PMON will perform a cross check, or PMON will validate the user ID, password details under the data dictionary cache. So what is this data dictionary cache or data dictionary area in the instance? Data dictionary cache is the area in the instance where base tables are copied and flushed out. Once again, data dictionary cache is the area in the instance where base tables are copied and flushed out. Now that our database instance is just now started, there will be nothing in the data dictionary cache. So what PMON will do is it will go to the hard disk. We know that our database resides on hard disk drive. It will go to the hard disk, and from the system table space, it will pull out the table which has the user ID and password details. And this table will be copied to data dictionary cache only. Why it is copied to data dictionary cache? Because it is a base table. Remember, there are different types of tables. For user tables, the working is different. For base tables, we have a dedicated area called as data dictionary cache. Now what happens when the base table is copied into the data dictionary cache? Now PMON will validate the credentials provided by the user with the table which is now in the memory, and then the result is given to the user. Now let us assume the result is successful. The listener will be removed. There will be a PGA, and there will be a server process which is created on the server side. Now these server process and private global area are responsible to execute whatever user sends from the user machine onto the server. So this is like friend of user process. Now user process resides on user server, right? So user process cannot get the work done on the database server. What user process will do is it will hand over work to its dedicated server process. Server process then works with instance and your database to get the work done for the user and gives the reply to the user. This is how the user connectivity happens in a database. Let us revise the user connectivity once again. We have a user process that runs on a user machine. User process sends the authentication details to listener. Listener sends the details to PMON. PMON then searches and validates the data under data dictionary cache. Why data dictionary cache? Because it's the area where the base tables are copied and then flushed out. What is the meaning of copying and flushing out? Because we know the properties of RAM. It works on an LRU algorithm. Every component inside the database instance will also work on LRU algorithm because your entire instance resides on RAM. So it has to follow whatever rules RAM follows. So let us assume our database server is just now started, which means there will be nothing in RAM. Ultimately, it means there will be nothing in the data dictionary cache. Then what PMON will do is it will go to your hard disk, and from the system table space where all your base tables reside, it will copy the base table which has the user authentication details to your data dictionary cache. Now that your table is available over here, PMON will validate the credentials provided by the user, and after that what it will do is it will give a success message to the user. It will create a server process and assign a private area or private memory to the server process. The listener will be removed, and listener will only come into picture when you have new connections. That means once the connection is established, there is no work of listener. The user process continues to talk to server process. Server process gets the work done from the database server and gives the results back to the user process. The listener will come into picture only when you have a new connection. Perfect. There is a very important interview question over here. Let us assume you have 1,000 users who are connected to your database server, and suddenly the listener goes down. What will happen to those 1,000 users? The answer is nothing, because listener will impact only the new connections. It will never impact the existing connections.